Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Thank you guys for showing up today. It's unfortunate that we don't have the FBI and anybody from Homeland Security here to testify before the committee. You guys have all discussed numerous attempts to and even successfully infiltrate by our adversaries to hack into our critical infrastructure. We've been talking about our healthcare system today, the power grid, water infrastructure, corporate infrastructure, federal agencies, etc. I know Director Wray of the FBI has even been up here in front of Congress testifying along these lines. I believe his quote was, "Chinese hackers are positioned on American infrastructure in preparation to wreak havoc and cause real-world harm to American citizens and communities if and when China decides the time has come to strike." One thing that my constituents often ask me is, why is nobody in the federal government ever held accountable for their failures? And I want to point out that I believe it was you, Mr. Myers, from CrowdStrike. You actually appeared before this very committee in the last Congress and actually took accountability for some of your company's failures. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, sir.
Knowing that, and that's one of the things that the American people are so frustrated about with the federal government. Nobody ever gets accountable. Rarely does anybody take any ownership of their failures. Mr. Myers, do you think some of your counterparts from the federal government today should take some ownership of some of the failures that have led to many of our adversaries acquiring access to our critical infrastructure that we've been talking about today? Would you like to see that?
I would like to see us move to a position where we're able to stop these things before they happen.
Okay, so you don't want to see any accountability? Mr. Myers, you don't want to see any government officials maybe sitting on this panel today take some ownership?
My role here is to...
Gotcha, thank you. To that point, I want to give some of the other members on this panel the opportunity to take some ownership of some of the failures that have allowed the Chinese and others to hack into some of our critical infrastructure. Does anybody want to take any ownership since you guys have been doing this for a very long time? I'll start with you, Mr. Wells.
So I would say that when I was in government, we were very clear about where we needed to make improvements, where there were failings, where we had not invested enough in the right areas, where we needed to make changes. I would say if I look back at, because I was acting director at the time as the SolarWinds campaign had emerged, was discovered, we identified that the federal government for too long had overinvested in some areas of network security and underinvested in endpoint monitoring. Came to Congress and said, we need new authorities to do this, we need additional funding, here is how we fix these problems because we were not in the right place. And since then, we have made dramatic improvements in the overall level of security. So I think where we've needed to be honest about the lack of capability in certain areas that has allowed certain attacks to happen, we've been clear about that.
Ms. Walden, how about you?
I was part of the apparatus that created the Office of the National Cyber Director so that, in the famous words of Senator King, Congress would have one throat to choke when something went down. I think what Mr. Wales said was absolutely true. We made movements to make sure that we are all singing off the same sheet of music, playing the same soccer game, whatever analogy you want. But I think the failure was a lack of coordination for some time.
Do you take any ownership in that, Ms. Walden?
And the lack of coordination?
Yeah.
I will own that I've worked to make sure that we had better coordination.
So none. Okay, thank you. Are you guys, Mr. Wells, are you familiar with this report, the weaponization of CISA, how a cybersecurity agency colluded with big tech and disinformation partners to censor Americans? I believe this was the Judiciary Committee.
Yes.
Mr. Wells, do you think it's appropriate to silence Americans for pointing out anomalies, data, and policy changes in, our last election or any election? Do you think that's appropriate for you guys to silence Americans?
I think Americans have free speech rights, and they can say what they want.
Okay. When you were in charge of CISA, did you ever oversee the censorship of any Americans for whatever views they might have held? whether you agreed with them or not?
No.
No? Okay. We've been talking today about some of the things that we can do to increase and bolster our cybersecurity efforts. And I agree. I do think that we need to go on the offensive. I believe it was you, Mr. Montgomery, you talked about, if we had foreign state actors placing satchel charges and explosives on our energy grid or anywhere else, we would raise holy hell and it would be an act of war. My question to you guys, my final question is, why aren't we doing it?
Well, sir, I think for too long, we've seen cyber as a non-military tool. And we just, we saw it as a nuisance and criminal actor tool. And that has dampened our response. As I pointed out, satchel charges, you and I'd be leading the charge to go find out who did this and hold them accountable. I just think with cyber, we take on this tempered approach that it doesn't kill people, even though we now know it does kill people. There are morbidity rates at hospitals that increase because of ransomware attacks. We know this. Look, it's a attitudinal change. I think on a bipartisan basis 5 or 6 years ago, we didn't see things this way. I hope on a bipartisan basis going forward, we can see that we need to go on the offensive and hold a country that does this kind of operational preparation of the battlefield against the United States accountable for their actions.
I got one more follow-up question. Mr. Wells, if you weren't censoring American citizens in CISA, why was it going on?
I don't believe it was.
So you completely disagree with this report? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
And you're under oath today?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I yield back. The real chairman is now back.